Step into the shadows with the Crime Journal, where every story peels back the layers of mystery, betrayal, and human darkness. So subscribe the channel. What you're about to hear is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about love, trust, and survival. A woman who trusted the man she married with her life, literally. But sometimes, the person sleeping next to you is the one planning your funeral. Before you click away, I need you to know, this case has a twist so shocking, it left seasoned detectives speechless. The events that unfolded in a quiet town changed everything we thought we knew about human greed and the will to survive. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why some secrets are worth killing for, and why some people refuse to stay buried. Millbrook Valley, a town where everyone knows everyone, where white picket fences line tree-covered streets, and where the biggest news usually involves the annual Harvest Festival. Nestled between rolling hills and ancient oak trees, this community of 12,000 souls prides itself on being the kind of place where doors remain unlocked and neighbors still borrow sugar from each other. But beneath this idyllic surface, as we'll discover, even the most perfect places can harbor the darkest secrets. Our story begins 15 years ago at Riverside University, where two young souls would meet and fall in love. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison was the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered. 21 years old, studying art history, she came from a family that had built their fortune in the jewelry business spanning 3 generations. Her father, Thomas Morrison, owned the most prestigious goldsmith shop in 3 counties, and their family name was synonymous with quality craftsmanship and honest business dealings. Marcus Daniel Chen was different, quiet, brooding, studying business administration on a partial scholarship, while Sarah's world was filled with gallery openings and family dinners at country clubs. Marcus worked nights at a local diner to pay for his textbooks. His family had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 12, and his parents ran a small restaurant downtown, working 16-hour days to make ends meet. They met on a rainy Tuesday in the university library. Sarah had dropped her art books, and Marcus helped her gather them. According to Sarah's college roommate, whom we interviewed, it was love at first sight, at least for Sarah. She came back to their dorm room that night absolutely glowing, unable to stop talking about the handsome stranger who had helped her. Marcus seemed more reserved about the connection, as if he couldn't believe someone from Sarah's world would be interested in someone from his. 3 years later, they married in what local newspapers called the wedding of the decade. Sarah's father, Thomas Morrison, spared no expense. The ceremony was held at the historic Millbrook Manor, with over 300 guests in attendance. The wedding videographer later told us that while Sarah looked like she was living a fairy tale, there was something calculating in Marcus's eyes during the vows, as if he was processing something beyond the romantic moment. The first few years seemed blissful. They moved into a beautiful colonial home on Elm Street, a wedding gift from Sarah's parents, worth over $400,000. Marcus started his own consulting business with startup money provided by his new father-in-law. Home videos from this period showed dinner parties, holiday celebrations, and what appeared to be a couple deeply in love and perfectly matched. Their former neighbor, Helen Carter, remembered them as seemingly the perfect couple at first. Sarah was always cheerful, organizing neighborhood events and bringing homemade cookies during the holidays. Marcus was quieter, more withdrawn, waving from the driveway but rarely joining community activities. Even then, there were subtle signs that not everything was as perfect as it appeared. But behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. According to marriage counselor records obtained through court documents, the couple began experiencing significant problems around their 5th year of marriage. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, their marriage counselor, treated them for approximately 18 months and described their issues as centering around control, financial disagreements, and what Sarah described as feeling diminished in her own relationship. The arguments became increasingly frequent and intense. Sarah would call her best friend Melissa Rodriguez late at night, crying, saying Marcus had accused her of treating him like an employee rather than a husband. Sarah felt guilty about her family's wealth, which was heartbreaking because she was known as the most generous person among her friends. She constantly tried to make Marcus feel equal and important in their relationship, but nothing seemed to be enough. Marcus's resentment grew deeper with each passing year. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices from their house, usually Marcus, shouting about money, respect, and what he perceived as Sarah's condescending attitude toward him. He began expressing to friends and business associates that he felt emasculated living in his wife's shadow, always being known as Sarah Morrison's husband rather than being recognized for his own achievements. Everything changed when Sarah's beloved father, Thomas Morrison, died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 67. The reading of his will would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to an unthinkable crime. Thomas Morrison had been very specific about his wishes in his will. The bulk of his estate, including the jewelry business, real estate holdings, and significant gold reserves, would go directly to Sarah. The inheritance was substantial. Conservative estimates placed its value at over $4 million, including the family's gold reserve that Thomas had been accumulating for decades. As a hedge against economic uncertainty, there were also multiple properties, investment accounts, and the highly profitable goldsmith business that had been in the Morrison family. For 3 generations, Sarah was now one of the wealthiest individuals in their small town. At the will reading, estate lawyer Richard Blackwood later recalled that, while Sarah wept openly for her father, Marcus's expression changed subtly as the extent of the inheritance became clear. There was something calculating that crossed his face, a slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth when he thought no one was looking. In the months following the inheritance, neighbors and friends noticed a dramatic change in Marcus's behavior. Almost overnight, he began driving a new BMW, wearing expensive clothes, and talking about investment opportunities. He started frequenting upscale restaurants and country clubs, spending money at a rate that alarmed even Sarah. Meanwhile, Sarah became more withdrawn and anxious than anyone had ever seen her. Financial records later revealed that Marcus had begun moving large sums from Sarah's accounts into his own business ventures, high-risk investments, and luxury purchases that Sarah knew nothing about. Bank manager David Thompson told investigators that Sarah came to see him about 6 months before the incident, concerned about unauthorized transfers. Her husband had power of attorney over certain accounts, but the amounts being moved were substantial, sometimes $40,000 at a time. Sarah appeared frightened during that bank meeting, constantly looking over her shoulder. She wanted to restructure the accounts to require both signatures, but was terrified that Marcus would discover she had gone behind his back. She asked for a week to think about it, a week she would never get. Unknown to Sarah, Marcus had been researching something far more sinister than business investments. Digital forensics experts later discovered a disturbing search history on his personal computer. Starting 8 months before the crime, investigators found searches for increasingly specific and chilling topics. How long can someone survive without oxygen underground? Remote camping locations within driving distance, untraceable poison symptoms, and most terrifyingly, how to dig a grave without detection. Marcus had also begun systematically destroying Sarah's reputation and mental state in the eyes of their friends and community. He started telling people that Sarah was becoming unstable following her father's death, claiming she had developed a drinking problem and was having severe mood swings. His business partner Steve Reynolds later recalled Marcus mentioning that Sarah was talking about suicide, saying things like, "Maybe I'd be better off with Dad." This character assassination served a dual purpose. It provided Marcus with a plausible explanation for Sarah's eventual disappearance, and it isolated Sarah from potential sources of help. Friends who might have noticed warning signs dismissed her anxiety as grief-related depression, exactly as Marcus had intended. 3 weeks before the crime, Marcus made what seemed like a romantic gesture, suggesting a camping trip to reconnect and help Sarah heal from her grief. He chose his words carefully, mentioning how Sarah used to talk about wanting to see the desert stars and proposing a remote location about 4 hours north with no cell service or distractions. To Sarah, desperate to save her marriage and still grieving her father's death, this seemed like the perfect opportunity for reconciliation. During that final week, Marcus made several suspicious purchases that would later prove crucial to the prosecution's case. Hardware store clerk Tommy Bridges remembered him clearly because of the odd combination of items: a high-end camping shovel, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, rope, and industrial-strength sedatives meant for large animals. When questioned about the unusual purchases, Marcus became nervous and mumbled something about his wife being afraid of wild animals. Marcus also withdrew $15,000 in cash from Sarah's account, telling the bank it was for camping equipment and a surprise for his wife. Most chillingly, he researched the exact location where he planned to commit his crime. The spot he chose was 40 miles from the nearest road, in a desert canyon known for its unstable soil and frequent landslides. A place where a body might never be found, or if discovered, could be explained as an accident. Friday, October 13th, a date Sarah would later say seemed like a dark omen she should have heeded. The morning began normally enough, with Sarah excitedly packing for what she believed would be a healing weekend with her husband. Her best friend Melissa Rodriguez received Sarah's last normal phone call that morning. Sarah was so happy, convinced that she and Marcus were finally going to work things out. Her final words to Melissa were prophetic. "I think everything's going to be okay now, Mel. I think we're going to be okay." The drive to their destination took for hours through increasingly desolate terrain. According to cell phone records, Sarah sent her last text message at 2:47 p.m. "Amazing scenery out here. No signal after this point. See everyone Monday." She had no way of knowing she was essentially writing her own disappearance notice, or that Marcus had specifically chosen a location where her cries for help would never be heard. During the drive, Marcus later confessed he had several moments where he almost turned back. Part of him still loved Sarah, or at least loved the memory of who she had been before money complicated everything. But his greed and resentment had grown too strong, and the promise of $4 million in inheritance kept him driving toward their remote destination. They arrived at the remote canyon location around 4 p.m. Marcus had chosen the spot carefully. After weeks of research, it was beautiful enough to seem romantic, with stunning views and a sense of isolation that Sarah would initially find peaceful. But it was also remote enough that no one would hear her screams, and the soil composition was perfect for digging. Marcus had even visited the location twice before to prepare, identifying the exact spot where he would bury his wife. As they set up camp, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in Marcus's behavior. He was unusually quiet and focused, almost businesslike in his approach to what should have been a romantic getaway. When Sarah tried to help with the gear, Marcus sharply pulled bags away from her, claiming he wanted everything to be perfect. His tone was harsher than usual, and for the first time, Sarah felt a flutter of genuine fear about being alone with her husband in such an isolated place. As evening approached, Marcus prepared what would unknowingly be Sarah's last meal as a free woman. He had dissolved a powerful sedative into her wine, the same animal tranquilizer he'd purchased at the hardware store, carefully researched to render her unconscious without immediate detection. The dosage was meant to be fatal, though Marcus would later claim he intended it only to make her death peaceful. Sarah noticed her wine tasted different, more cloudy than usual, but Marcus quickly explained it was an expensive bottle from her father's collection. The mention of her beloved father brought tears to her eyes, and she drank more deeply, touched by what seemed like Marcus's thoughtful gesture. She didn't notice that Marcus wasn't drinking from his own glass, or that his hands were trembling as he watched her consume the drugged wine. As the sedative took effect, Sarah became drowsy and confused. She tried to stand but stumbled, and Marcus caught her with what appeared to be loving concern. But his voice had turned cold and calculating as he told her it would all be over soon. Sarah's last conscious moments were filled with the terrifying realization that the man she had loved and trusted for 12 years was the architect of her doom. What happened next is based on Marcus's own confession and physical evidence found at the scene. Marcus carried Sarah's unconscious body to a spot he had prepared earlier, a shallow grave. He had begun digging while she was setting up their campsite, telling her he was gathering firewood. The grave was approximately 4 feet deep, dug in sandy soil that would be easy to move but stable enough to contain a body. Marcus later told police he believed Sarah was dead when he buried her, claiming the sedative was meant to make her death peaceful because he couldn't bear the thought of her suffering. However, toxicology reports would later prove that while the dose was dangerous and could have been fatal, it was not immediately lethal. Sarah was unconscious but alive when her husband placed her in the ground and began covering her with dirt. The physical evidence painted a picture of a man in a hurry, perhaps losing his nerve or realizing the magnitude of what he was doing. The grave was shallow, only about 4 feet deep. If Marcus truly believed his wife was dead and wanted to conceal the crime permanently, investigators noted he would likely have dug deeper. The shallow depth suggests either panic or, more chillingly, some unconscious part of him that wasn't entirely sure she was gone. After burying Sarah, Marcus began executing the cover-up he had planned for months. He carefully removed all traces of the grave, scattered leaves and rocks over the disturbed earth, and packed up their campsite as if Sarah had simply wandered off. He drove home alone, arriving Sunday evening as scheduled, and immediately began his performance as the concerned husband whose wife had mysteriously vanished. Marcus called 911 Sunday night, his voice carefully modulated to convey the right amount of distress and confusion. He reported that Sarah had gone for a walk Saturday evening to watch the sunset from a ridge and never returned. He claimed he had searched all night, calling her name for hours, before finally driving to get help. His story was detailed and consistent, the product of months of planning. The 911 call was masterfully performed. Marcus sounded like exactly what he was pretending to be, a devoted husband in crisis, desperate for help finding his missing wife. He mentioned Sarah's recent struggles with grief, her father's death, and suggested she might be lost or injured. Every word was calculated to create the narrative he needed. A mentally unstable woman who had wandered into the desert and met with an accident. A massive search and rescue operation was launched Monday morning. Over 50 volunteers, search dogs, and helicopter crews scoured the canyon area where Marcus claimed Sarah had disappeared. The search coordinator, Captain Robert Hayes, later said that Marcus seemed like a devoted husband in crisis, out there every day helping search, calling Sarah's name, appearing genuinely distraught about his wife's disappearance. Marcus's performance was flawless. He gave emotional interviews to local news stations, pleading for Sarah's safe return and describing her as the love of his life who had been struggling since her father's death. He mentioned her supposed drinking problem and suggested she might have been disoriented when she wandered off. Every public appearance reinforced his carefully constructed narrative of a grief-stricken wife who had met with a tragic accident. For 3 days, Marcus maintained his charade with remarkable consistency. He stayed at the search site during the day, went home to an empty house at night, and fielded concerned calls from friends and family with appropriate levels of hope and despair. If anyone had suggested then that this grieving husband had actually buried his wife alive, just miles from where they were searching, they would have been dismissed as delusional. But while Marcus was playing the part of the grieving widower, 40 miles away in a shallow grave, something extraordinary was happening. Sarah Chen was fighting for her life in a battle that would become one of the most remarkable survival stories in recent criminal history. According to Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, an emergency medicine specialist, surviving burial alive requires an almost impossible combination of factors: enough air space around the body, the right depth to prevent crushing, proper soil conditions that allow for some air circulation, and most importantly, the mental strength to not panic. Panic uses oxygen faster than anything else, and most people buried alive die from suffocation caused by their own terror, rather than lack of air. Incredibly, several factors worked in Sarah's favor, though she wouldn't realize this until later. The desert soil was loose and sandy, creating small air pockets around her body. Marcus's shallow grave, intended to save him time and effort, actually saved Sarah's life by reducing the weight of earth pressing down on her. Most crucially, the animal sedative, while dangerous, had slowed her metabolism and breathing, reducing her oxygen consumption during the critical first hours. Sarah later described waking up in complete darkness, initially disoriented and confused. About where she was, the sedative had left her groggy and weak, but as consciousness returned, the horrifying reality became clear. She was buried alive, surrounded by dirt, with limited air and no way to call for help. The initial wave of panic nearly overwhelmed her, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm, knowing that panic would kill her faster than anything else. Her first coherent thought, she later told investigators, wasn't anger at Marcus but sadness that the man she had loved and trusted had become capable of such an act. But that sadness quickly transformed into determination. She began to carefully assess her situation, testing how much space she had to move, trying to determine which direction was up, and calculating how much air she might have. The space around Sarah was cramped, but not completely constricting. She could move her arms slightly and turn her head. More importantly, she could feel small currents of air, suggesting that the grave wasn't completely sealed. This gave her hope that survival was possible, but she knew she would have to act quickly and conserve her strength for the enormous physical effort that lay ahead. For 18 grueling hours, Sarah fought to free herself, clawing through dirt with her fingernails until they broke and bled, pushing upward with muscles weakened by the sedative, conserving her strength when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. She later said she talked to her deceased father during the worst moments, asking him to give her strength and promising she wouldn't let Marcus win. The physical challenge was enormous. Sarah had to move tons of dirt with her bare hands, working in complete darkness, fighting against gravity and the constant threat of the walls collapsing around her. She rationed her energy carefully, working for periods then resting to conserve oxygen, always fighting the panic that threatened to consume. Her air supply died around hour 15. Sarah's hand finally broke through to the surface. The feeling of air on her fingers gave her a surge of adrenaline and hope that carried her through the final hours of digging. She clawed frantically to enlarge the hole, eventually creating an opening large enough to pull herself through. When she finally emerged from her grave Tuesday morning, she had been buried for nearly 60 hours. Sarah emerged from her grave dehydrated, injured, and barely conscious, but alive. Her clothes were torn, her hands were bloody from clawing through dirt, and she was covered in sand and debris. But her ordeal wasn't over. She still had to find help in the middle of the desert, with no water, no food, and no clear sense of direction. By pure chance, Park Ranger Miguel Santos was conducting an early morning wildlife survey when he spotted what he first thought was a mirage, a figure wandering near the main road, about 3 miles from the campsite. As he got closer, he realized it was a woman in desperate condition, covered in dirt and stumbling like someone in severe distress. When Santos approached Sarah, she was barely coherent, but managed to identify herself and explain that her husband had drugged her and buried her alive. Santos immediately called for medical evacuation and began treating the scene as a crime scene rather than a rescue operation. Sarah was rushed to the nearest hospital while police began the process of arresting the man who had spent 3 days playing the role of concerned husband. As Sarah was being treated at the hospital, police immediately shifted their focus to Marcus as a suspect rather than a grieving husband. Detective Sarah Williams led the interrogation, and she later described Marcus's reaction to learning his wife was alive as one of the most chilling moments in her career. When detectives told Marcus that Sarah had been found alive, his face went through a series of expressions that revealed everything: initial shock, confusion, and for just a moment, something that looked distinctly like disappointment. His first questions weren't about Sarah's condition or how he could see her, but about where she had been found and what she had told the police. Marcus maintained his innocent facade for nearly an hour, expressing confusion about how Sarah could have been buried and insisting he wanted to see his wife immediately. But when detectives told him that Sarah had specifically requested he not be allowed anywhere near her, and that she had made very specific accusations about what he had done, Marcus's carefully constructed mask finally cracked. In a moment that was captured on the interrogation room recording, Marcus put his head in his hands and quietly said the words that would seal his fate. She was supposed to die. The dosage should have killed her. It was a full confession, delivered not with remorse, but with frustration that his plan had failed. 3 days later, Sarah was strong enough to give her full statement to police. But first, she requested something unusual. She wanted to face her husband one final time, against the advice of her doctors and the investigating detectives. Sarah insisted on this confrontation, saying she needed Marcus to understand exactly what he had put her through and how his actions had failed. The meeting took place in Sarah's hospital room, with detectives present and recording everything. Sarah, connected to IVs, but sitting upright and alert, faced the man who had tried to murder her for money. Her first words were simple but powerful. She had trusted him with her life, literally, and he had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Sarah told Marcus that, for 12 years, he had made her feel guilty for having the financial security her father had worked his entire life to build. He had made her believe she was the problem in their marriage, when in reality, his resentment and greed were poisoning everything they had together. The money hadn't changed anything, she said. It had simply revealed who Marcus really was. When Marcus tried to explain that the sedative was supposed to make her death peaceful, Sarah cut him off. She pointed out that he had drugged his wife, buried her alive, and then spent 3 days playing the grieving widower on television, while she fought for her life underground. There was no version of those facts that painted him as anything other than a cold-blooded murderer. Finally, Marcus broke down and admitted the truth that had been eating at him for years. He said he had loved Sarah, but he loved the lifestyle her money could provide even more. He had grown to hate himself for that, which made him hate her in return. It was the most honest thing he had said in their relationship in years, and it came far too late to matter. Sarah's final words to her husband were both forgiveness and condemnation. She told him she survived 18 hours in a grave he had dug for her, clawing her way out with broken fingers and sheer determination. What had kept her fighting was the thought of seeing justice and ensuring he never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her. She hoped someday he would find peace with who he was, but he would find it in prison. Marcus Chen's trial became a media sensation, dubbed by newspapers as the buried wife trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The computer searches, the financial records, the hardware store purchases, the elaborate cover-up, and most damning of all, his own recorded confession. Prosecutor Jennifer Martinez later said it was one of the clearest cases of premeditation she had ever seen. Sarah's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Sitting in the witness stand, she recounted every detail of her ordeal with remarkable clarity and composure. She described waking up buried alive, the 18 hours of desperate struggle to escape, and the psychological impact of realizing that the person who was supposed to love and protect her had instead tried to murder her for money. The defense team attempted to argue that this was a tragic accident, that Marcus genuinely believed Sarah had died from the sedative and was trying to cover up what he thought was an accidental overdose. But the evidence of premeditation was too strong. The months of planning, the specific location chosen for its isolation, and the elaborate cover-up story all pointed to deliberate murder. Expert witnesses testified about the impossibility of surviving burial alive under normal circumstances, making Sarah's escape seem almost miraculous. Medical experts explained how the sedative should have been fatal at the dosage Marcus administered, and that Sarah's survival was due to a combination of fortunate circumstances and extraordinary determination. After deliberating for just 6 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges: attempted murder in the first degree, kidnapping, and fraud related to the insurance policies Marcus had taken out on Sarah's life just months before the crime. The judge sentenced Marcus Chen to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crime an act of such calculated cruelty that it defies comprehension. During the sentencing, Sarah chose not to deliver a victim impact statement. She later explained that she had already said everything she needed to say to Marcus. During their hospital confrontation, she wanted her survival to be her statement, proof that some people cannot be buried, literally or figuratively, no matter how deep others try to dig their graves. Marcus showed no emotion as he was led away in shackles. Prison records indicate he has never expressed genuine remorse for his actions, only regret that his plan failed. He has appealed his conviction multiple times, all unsuccessfully, and continues to maintain that Sarah's survival was impossible, and that her testimony must somehow be fabricated. Today, 5 years after her ordeal, Sarah Chen has rebuilt her life on her own terms. She sold the house she shared with Marcus and moved to a different state, using her inheritance to establish a foundation that helps domestic violence survivors escape dangerous situations. She says her experience taught her that survival is possible even in the most impossible circumstances. Sarah has undergone years of therapy to deal with the psychological trauma of being buried alive by someone she loved. She suffers from claustrophobia and has difficulty trusting people, but she has found purpose in helping other women recognize the warning signs she missed in her own marriage. Her foundation has helped over 100 women escape dangerous relationships. The case has been studied by criminologists and psychologists as an example of how financial stress and toxic masculinity can transform love into murderous resentment. Marcus's progression from resentful husband to would-be killer followed a predictable pattern that experts now use to train law enforcement officers and social workers in recognizing dangerous domestic situations. Sarah has never remarried and says she may never trust someone enough to share her life completely again. But she has found peace and purpose in her work and in proving that some secrets are worth surviving for, not killing for. She recently wrote a book about her experience, with all proceeds going to domestic violence organizations. The desert canyon where Sarah Chen fought for her life has been marked with a small memorial, not for a death, but for a resurrection. Rangers report that visitors sometimes leave flowers at the spot where Sarah clawed her way out of her grave, turning a place of intended murder into a symbol of survival and determination. Sarah's story reminds us that evil often wears a familiar face, that the person sleeping next to us might be capable of unthinkable acts, and that greed can transform love into something monstrous. But it also proves that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limits, can accomplish the impossible. Marcus Chen believed he had committed the perfect crime, a murder disguised as a tragic disappearance, with financial gain as the motive, and an elaborate cover-up to ensure he was never caught. He planned for every contingency except one: the possibility that his victim would refuse to stay buried. In the end, the man who thought he could bury his problems discovered that some things cannot be buried: not truth, not justice, and certainly not the indomitable will of a woman who simply refused to die. Sarah Chen's survival was more than just a physical achievement. It was a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the deepest darkness. As we finish this story, remember that domestic violence takes many forms, and financial abuse is often the precursor to physical violence. If you or someone you know is experiencing warning signs like those Sarah missed, isolation, financial control, character assassination, or escalating verbal abuse, help is available. Sarah Chen survived 18 hours buried alive because she refused to give up hope. Sometimes, hope is the only tool we have to dig ourselves out of the darkest places. And sometimes, as Sarah proved, that's enough. Final words: some people are buried by life's circumstances. Others are buried by those they trust. But the strongest among us refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave or how heavy the earth. This is Sarah Chen's story, a reminder that